Hello everyone. So today I'm going to do my presentation on influenza. I just wanted to let you know a little bit more about influenza and how it spread. So influenza, the word influenza is actually, it comes from the Italian language meaning to influence, which is a reference to how the disease is spread and how the disease is actually caused. It was actually introduced into the English language in the mid-18th century during a pan-European epidemic. And other archaic terms for influenza, so words that were used in the past but aren't used as frequently anymore, are things such as la grippe, which is French, and there's also sweating sickness and also Spanish fever. And the term Spanish fever was used during the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. So firstly, what is influenza? Influenza is a form of respiratory illness and it's caused by the infection of the influenza virus. So if someone has influenza, it's caused by the influenza virus, and this influenza will cause them to have respiratory distress. And the type of virus which is most commonly known to cause this distress is either influenza A or influenza B. Influenza can be split into four different subtypes, A, B, C, and D. The most commonly known and heard of are A and B. This is because these are the viruses that have infected humans and have caused quite a significant effect on the health of the humans. So influenza C does infect humans and has been known to infect humans, but it's quite mild and uncommon, and because of this, it's considered as much of a public health risk. And influenza D has only been known to infect cattle, so has not been known to have any symptoms or effects on humans. So there's nothing to show that influenza D can infect humans. Influenza A can then be further subdivided into subtypes using the glycoproteins on the surface of the virus. These glycoproteins are called hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, and when naming the viruses, these glycoproteins are used. For example, two types of influenza A are H1N1 and H3N2, which refer to the types of hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. And H1N1 and H3N2 are the currently circulating viruses. Another way that they can be written is by using the pandemics that they may have caused. For an example, the 2009 pandemic, which was caused by H1N1, can be termed AH1N1 PDM09. So if it's written like that, that is what it's referring to. Influenza B does not have the same subtypes, but it is broken down into lineages, such as B. Yamagata and B. Victoria lineage. And these are the two influenza B viruses that are circulating at the moment. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the glycoproteins on the surface of the virus. So the H stands for hemagglutinin, and this can be broken down into heme and agglutinous, which are Latin for blood and unite or cause to adhere. And this is because hemagglutinin has this function of being able to cause blood to clot and blood to bind together. The purpose of hemagglutinin is to bind viruses to sialic acid on the membrane of cells, so cells such as the cells on the upper respiratory tract or erythrocytes, so blood cells. And the reason that this is so useful is that this allows the virus to enter the cell. And then neuraminidase, which is the N, is an enzyme which cleaves the sialic acid bonds, allowing the virus to exit the cell. So now I'm going to talk a bit about what the virus needs to do to survive after it's infected the host cell. So first, it needs to attach to the cell, and it does this using very specific receptors. After attaching, it needs to penetrate so it can enter the cell. It does this using nucleic acid and also using hemagglutinin. After it's inside the cell, it needs to synthesize so that it can replicate its own RNA and so it can reproduce inside the cell. After the RNA is reproduced, it needs to be assembled so that there can be whole viruses that are ready to be released. After they're assembled, they're released using lysis and also with the aid of neuraminidase. And looking into the etymology of the word lysis, I found that it comes from Greek and Latin origins and generally meaning to unfasten, loosen, or untie, which is relevant in the virus escaping the cell so that it can be released. So now we're on to antigenic shift and drift, which is when the glycoproteins on the surface of the virus undergo antigenic variation. This is really important as it's what causes different strains to come about, and it's why we need different vaccinations each year because our body's antibodies no longer can fight the viruses because the antigens on the surface of the viruses have changed. So first we'll start with antigenic drift. Antigenic drift is the accumulation of mutations over time. So different point mutations gradually occur and this results in a change in the glycoproteins. And the second way that the influenza virus can undergo antigenic variation is through antigenic shift. So the influenza virus has 8 segments in its genome, and these 8 segments can be reassorted. And this can be done when different viruses infect the same cell. As can be seen by this diagram here, there are two viruses and there are two viruses and they infect the host cell. And once they infect the host cell, once they're inside the cell, they swap and exchange bits of gene, and this causes a new virus to be produced. I'm now going to quickly run over shift versus drift. So shift, there's a new subtype, there's major antigenic change, and in shift, the shift can move from one species to another. And due to the shift is due to the reassortment in the genome between different subtypes. Shift also occurs in only influenza A and causes pandemics. Whereas drift forms a new strain of virus. It's much more change in antigens. It's much more minor. It can infect animals of the same species, but it can't cross the species barrier. It's a result of collection of point mutations in the gene. It occurs in influenza A, B, and C, and it's what causes epidemics in between pandemics. And this is an example of it. Next, I'm just going to quickly run through pandemic. So I'm looking into the etymology of the word pandemic. Pan means all and demos means people. Influenza has seen 4 major pandemics. So the first being in 1918 with the Spanish flu, which is termed H1N1, which was a reassortment of bird, swine, human flu viruses, and it killed an estimate of 21.5 to 39.3 million people. The next is in 1957 with the Asian flu, which is H2N2, which was reassortment between human and avian viruses. So it's thought to have been caused by a mixture in a mutated wild duck strain and a pre-existing human strain. The death toll was about 2 million people, according to the World Health Organization. And then antigenic shift of this H2N2 virus is then what led to the 1968 to 1969 Hong Kong flu, the H3N2, which killed approximately 1 million people worldwide. And the most recent one is in 2009 with swine flu. Epidemics compared to pandemics are much smaller scale. Looking at the words, epi is among slash upon slash near, and demos means people. And this is what we have yearly, and it's known as seasonal influenza, and it's known to occur more in the winter months. How is influenza spread? So influenza is spread via droplets and direct skin-to-skin contact. And this means that influenza can be spread really, really rapidly, especially in crowded places such as hospitals and schools. Symptoms. Another way that influenza can be distinguished is by the symptoms, and this can distinguish complicated and not complicated. So uncomplicated influenza has an initial presentation of symptoms which lasts for 1 to 4 days and it's an abrupt onset. Symptoms such as malaise, mal meaning bad, ease meaning ease, which is a general feeling of pain and discomfort. Then myalgia, which is muscle pain, myo meaning muscle and algia meaning pain. We also have arthralgia, which is joint pain, with the arthro meaning joint and algia meaning pain. Another symptom being fever, headache, and other symptoms such as coughs, sore throats, and nasal discharge. In terms of complicated influenza, it normally requires hospital admission, and the symptoms are normally for lower respiratory tract infections. So things such as hypoxemia, dyspnea, and also pulmonary infiltrate. What are the complications that can arise? So one complication that can arise is pneumonia, and pneumonia is the inflammation of the lungs. And there are two types of pneumonia that can be caused by influenza. So the first primary being viral, so when the infection itself causes pneumonia, and this needs to be treated using antivirals such as Tamiflu, Relenza, or Rapipab. And secondary is bacteria. This is because the initial infection has caused the lungs to be damaged and therefore are more vulnerable to bacterial infection. Abrupt antibiotics are required to treat this. Complications such as diseases in the central nervous system can also be caused. Another thing to consider is who's at most risk. So those who are immunosuppressed or who have chronic medical conditions are at quite a high risk of getting influenza, as well as those who are pregnant or 2 weeks postpartum. People who are very young and the elderly are also a very high risk, as well as those who have a very high BMI. When looking to the future of influenza, it's important to keep on track and on top of the spread of the influenza and the different strains that have come about. And a way that we can do this is by surveillance and monitoring. So the World Health Organization has databases that monitor the cases and the spread of influenza in different countries. And this is really important in having a sense of control of influenza. Another way that we can try to control the spread of influenza and to prevent people from getting it is by vaccinations. Although these change every year, it is still really, really important to have vaccines and to be immunized against hemagglutinin and neuraminidase components. An example of this is Tamiflu, which is a neuraminidase inhibitor. Another way that we can prevent the spread and the effect of influenza is through public health preparedness. So by raising awareness through campaigns and initiatives such as Catch It, Bin It, Kill It, and also the CDC's Take 3. By doing these, we're able to prevent the spread of the disease and to make sure that people are more aware of it. Thank you for listening and questions.